Hi, everybody. Welcome. We do a sound test of people that are online. Can you check? Can you type in the chat and let us know if you can hear us?
Audio is great. Yep.
Awesome. Yay. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to our January 6th, 2022 Door County Maritime Speaker Series, sponsored by the Door County Medical Center. For those of you who are watching online, please keep yourselves muted and keep your video off. It helps our bandwidth for everybody. And for all of you in the audience, make sure your cell phones are muted, please. So tonight, you got it, Brennan? Are you off? Are you sure? Just especially you.
Yeah.
We're here tonight to talk about some new connections about one of Door County's namesakes, Death's Door. Tonight's presenter, Brennan Christianson, is going to talk about some of the reasons the passage received its name and how history is often subjective.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Many of you prior to this presentation may have heard of the name Death's Door, maybe from all the Facebook posts I've been posting everywhere about people coming to this presentation, but regardless, some of those.
Sorry, you're on the wrong screen. Let's go stand in front of that.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so of those who've heard about Death's Door, some of you may have heard there's a legend associated with the name. Some of those people may have known that there's actually multiple legends associated with the name. Over the last year, as site manager for the Death's Door Maritime Museum, I get a lot of people who come in and will just ask, where does the name Death's Door come from? Usually they hear something along the lines of, a large force of cannibalistic, human-sacrificing warriors pushed out a peaceful group of natives from the Door Peninsula. The peaceful natives decided to break with their former practices and conduct a sneak attack. Scouts were sent out to clear out a landing zone in advance by lighting a signal fire, but all three were captured and burnt at the stake until the last one revealed the plans of the peaceful tribe. So, knowing what they were doing, they lit the fire in the wrong place, and this led to a huge catastrophe where all the peaceful natives washed ashore and died in a big accident. Now, with their land exposed, the ferocious cannibalistic natives decided that they would go on a counterattack, and they would launch a huge fleet of canoes going towards Washington Island until suddenly a huge storm arose and just washed them all out. Suddenly, the bad natives, as generally people would present them, would then waded ashore and saw that all the canoes had washed up. Realizing their warriors were gone, they decided that this was a sign not to go any further, and they named the passage Death's Door. This legend is very problematic for pretty obvious reasons. So that needs to kind of be re-examined. And so we can then talk about what really happened going forward from that. So please note your...
No, not yet.
So please note your questions and ideas and save them for discussion at the end of the presentation. I'd like to give a special thanks to Professor Patrick J. Young of MSOE and Professors Joan and Michael Crone of UWGB for helping me with editing and research for this presentation.
Okay, I think we got it. We're on the wrong camera.
Okay. One moment.
Okay.
Okay, it's not coming up on the screen. So.
Oh, you're going to turn the TV back on.
Oh. Okay. Yep. Okay. So, what is Death's Door? Death's Door physically is a passage of water that flows just north of the Door Peninsula to the south shore of Plum Island, right there. Oh, right. I know. Thank you. Okay. And it connects Green Bay over on the left to Lake Michigan over on the right. And due to its location, it's actually a very important trade route historically in the state of Wisconsin. Today, it's mostly used by the Washington Island Ferry Line, leaving from Northport to Washington Island. In fact, until the building of the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal in the late 19th century, Death's Door was actually the most traveled trade route in the entire state. The name Death's Door literally comes from the French term Porte de Mort, which literally means door to death. The earliest known written source that mentions the term Death's Door in connection with the waterway comes from French missionary Emmanuel Crespel in 1728. However, the naming more likely precedes this time period. To understand where the name might have come from, it is important to understand the context, the time period and area of the first recorded source, which spanned from the mid-17th to the early 18th century in early Wisconsin. For those of you from the state of Wisconsin, which I'm going to assume is the vast majority of you, you may have been taught that John Nicolay was the first European to land on this soil. He still was, not disputing that, but just it's a setup. Nicolay arrived as part of a diplomatic mission to broker peace between the Hurons, who were trading with the French, and the Puans, also referred to as the Winnebagos, a powerful tribe that lived on the eastern shores of Green Bay. Around the time of Nicolay's arrival, the Puans and the Menominee controlled the Bay of Green Bay through a Puan-led alliance. Through his work as a linguist and negotiator, Nicolay brokered a truce between the Puans and the Huron. He then traveled back to Montreal, and the French didn't come back until the 1650s. By that time, the situation in Wisconsin had completely changed. In 1634, when Nicolay arrived, the Puans had a population of around 20,000 and a fighting force of around 5,000. When the French returned in the 1650s, the Puans had been reduced to a population of around 500, with the Menominee only numbering around 200. This loss of life was due to a disastrous war with the Illinois Confederacy, a powerful group in northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, which left the Puans and the Menominee on the verge of extinction. At the same time, a disastrous war was taking place in Michigan, which was causing a lot of its own turmoil. The Haudenosaunee, or as many people know them, the Iroquois, were expanding into Michigan. With their use of firearms, they were able to push out or forcibly integrate a large number of people. This created large numbers of refugees who poured into the now sparsely populated northeast Wisconsin. The weakening of the local Puans and Menominee allowed a mostly uncontested influx of these new tribal members, which created a brand new environment with 3 different language families, Algonquian, Siouan, and Iroquoian, over a dozen tribes and a population density of 15 to 20,000, all within a 3 days travel of Green Bay. 2 new changes came as a result of this new environment: conflict over limited resources and a new social order based around villages. As historian Richard White wrote, this was a village world. The units called tribes, nations, and confederacies were only loose leagues of villages. The nature of authority within a Potawatomi village and that within a Miami village might at least initially differ significantly, but in neither case did authority extend beyond the village. These villages were not homogeneous either. As tribes grew together geographically, marriage between villages became quite common. This created new familial ties and increased the diversity of the villages. So many tribesmen were changing villages that determining strict borders was rather difficult. Not just borders, but the loyalties of these people became much more complex as familial, political, and economic ties made individual loyalties change depending on what was happening. This system of intermarried, heterogeneous village governments became the standard of Wisconsin for the next several decades. I know, real mouthful. The competition over limited resources, on the other hand, was made very much more complicated due to the involvement of the French. The French were interested in 2 things: profiting off the fur trade and stopping the Iroquois from making them profit off the fur trade. The native population of Wisconsin was interested in gaining the technological advancements of the French, namely iron tools and firearms. The natives were willing to trade fur for guns, but needed to travel to Montreal to do so. This would involve going through Lake Michigan and going through all the other Great Lakes except Lake Superior and going all the way up into modern French Canada just to get the guns they needed and then come all the way back. The problem is that the Iroquois controlled a lot of the waterways that got people from Wisconsin to Montreal. So really, the only time these trades were conducted when there was a peace between the French and the Iroquois. This did happen on two major stints. First one was between the 1660s and the 1670s, when the Iroquois had peace with everyone else, and then they went their own way and wiped out the Illinois Confederacy. And after the end of the Iroquois Wars in 1701. During the times of peace, villages would form trade fleets with hundreds of traveling members carrying hundreds, if not thousands of pounds of fur and traveling all the way to Montreal to trade for guns. These breaks were the safest time to travel from Wisconsin to Montreal and would have been the likeliest time large groups of natives would have been passing through Death's Door. Okay, with this background in mind, I'll move on to the written sources talking specifically about Death's Door. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Conan Brian Eden, in his book Death's Door in Pursuit of a Legend, wrote that the first written source referring to Death's Door came from the French missionary Emmanuel Crespel in 1728. Crespel was accompanying a French military expedition that was heading from Montreal to the Fox Valley. While passing through Death's Door Passage, a few of the canoes that they were traveling in got caught in a gust of wind and broke upon the shores. Luckily, nobody died, and they were able to transfer all the people to different canoes, and they made it on their way. Crespel then just called the place passing through Cap de Mort, which means point of death. The next reference to Death's Door would not come for nearly a century. In 1817, Willard Keyes wrote about a trip he took from Vermont to Wisconsin, so-called, in his journal, he writes, August 11th, past Point de Mort, so-called from the many Indian canoes wrecked there and attempting to pass the point, which is perpendicular. Rocks rising out of the water. That same year, Samuel Storrow, judge advocate stationed in Wisconsin, wrote about the passage during one of his travels. He writes, leaving the beautiful island, in reference to Washington Island, we reached on the 16th the southerly Cape of Green Bay, Port de Mort, so-called from the destruction at this place by a number of the Potawatomis. These three accounts are pretty straightforward, lasting from a sentence to a paragraph in length. Each mention of Death's Door is stated as a matter of fact, implying that none of them actually came up with the name, just stating they passed through something called Port de Mort. This would mean the naming would be prior to at least 1728, but how far back is more open to interpretation. The next account comes from Samuel Stambaugh, who was an Indian agent stationed in Green Bay between 1831 and 1832. In his report to the Secretary of War, reports on the equality and condition of Wisconsin Territory, 1831. I know, they were so creative in their name. Stambaugh gives a more in-depth explanation of the events surrounding the name Death's Door. His version tells an account of a native tribe that was heading to an unnamed French trading post when the trade party decided to take a break. They rested on a stone table jutting out of the peninsula. A storm suddenly formed in huge force and pushed the trade party into the water, while the canoes were broken against the cliffside. Those who didn't die instantly drowned while trying to make it to shore. The area was then known as Death's Door from then onwards. In 1839, Michigan state geologist Douglas Houghton was passing through the area and wrote about Death's Door in his journal. He states the name came from a native war party that was driven against the cliffs during a storm with only 3 or 4 survivors. Both of these accounts leave out when the event took place, which tribes were involved, nor mentioned where they heard the story from. Stambaugh's account is the first one that actually has a narrative with a motivation of why natives would be passing through Death's Door, a trade mission in this case. Well, Houghton's account is the first narrative to say that this motivation was militaristic in nature. Neither Stambaugh nor Houghton had much reason to embellish their accounts. One was in a private journal and the other was for a military report. Stambaugh's main purpose for being in the area was to see if Northeast Wisconsin would be suitable for the Stockbridge, Muncie, and Oneida, while Houghton was actually on his way to the Keweenaw Peninsula. And so neither one of them were really experts on the area. Their reports weren't really about Death's Door. So it's more than likely they just heard something from locals, and they just couldn't accept it as fact, put it in a report, and sent it on its way. The last primary source, and probably the strangest one, is from Congressional Representative James Jesse Strang, the Mormon King of Beaver Island. And that's a whole other story in its own right. His account claims that an army loyal to Pontiac during Pontiac's War in 1763 was passing through Death's Door and was caught in a storm and was destroyed. Big problem is that, as we have seen, Crespo's account comes from 1728, and Pontiac's War wasn't for another 4 decades or so. So it's pretty likely that he didn't know what he was talking about. A later publishing of this account actually states that he must have been mistaken, and instead of Pontiac's forces, it was Potawatomis that were set upon by the Puans. So, as it can be seen, even though Father Emmanuel Crespo here has the first accounts, all the other ones are all within like a 40-ish year period from 1817 to 1854. I think this can be easily explained by the number of Americans that were actually coming to the area at this time. Prior to this, you had the native tribes, many of the French, but now as administrators and soldiers and settlers started showing up, they started reporting on landmarks and names, and they started talking about where the names came from. And so now we're getting all these reports of Death's Door because now new people are moving in and have to explain why there is a body of water called Death's Door in their new territory. So this would explain why the accounts just kind of pick up. So on to secondary sources. Let's see, as the population of Door County increased, historians started to write and publish works on the history of the county. Part of the history includes the naming of Death's Door. There are 3 historians who prominently talking about the naming of Death's Door: Charles I. Martin, George R. Fox, and Hjalmar Holland. These 3 historians published either books or articles that mention an in-depth look at the legends surrounding the name of Death's Door, usually as context for a broader subject that they are talking about. Charles Martin was the first to publish an account of Death's Door in his 1881 book, History of Door County, Wisconsin. His account begins with the Potawatomi, who he claimed live on a group of islands north of the Door Peninsula, now called the Potawatomi Islands. Go figure. In the late 17th century. While on a hunting expedition onto the mainland, the home islands were left undefended. A neighboring tribe, the Ojibwe, decided to take advantage of this and took over the islands, leaving the Potawatomi homeless. In retaliation, the Potawatomi sent every able-bodied warrior to retake the islands during a night raid. Unfortunately for the Potawatomi, a large storm struck the war party, killing every warrior they sent out. The bodies of the fallen Potawatomi warriors washed up on the shores of Detroit Island, just south of Washington Island, where their graves could still be found until the mid-19th century, according to Martin. The Potawatomi, believing that an evil spirit created the storm, named the passage Death's Door as a warning not to cross it again. George Fox published an article about those same grave sites in the Wisconsin Archaeologist in 1915. The article's main purpose was not to talk about Death's Door, but about those grave sites, so he needed to explain what Death's Door was as context. He describes that the Potawatomis are involved, but actually they were the invaders in his version, and the defenders were the Noquets, a group closely related to the Menominee. Despite the noted abundance of resources on the Potawatomi Islands, the Noquets all left the islands, leaving them wide open for attack. The Potawatomi took over the islands while the Noquets were gone, which was followed by a counterattack by the Noquets. In their haste, the Noquets failed to give an offering to the Manitou, or the Great Spirit. So when they passed the waters, they were all wiped out in a giant storm. From then on, it was called Death's Door. The most famous account, and the one I kind of give a kind of brief description of at the beginning of this presentation, was by Hjalmar Holland, which can be found in his book, Door County, Wisconsin, The County Beautiful, which was published in 1917. Holland's version is the most in-depth of the 3 accounts and deviates from the other 2 the most. His version of the tale involves the Potawatomi, who, according to Holland, are the indigenous population of the Door Peninsula, and the Puans, who he describes as the invaders. According to Holland, the Potawatomi were the most affable and generous of Wisconsin tribes. The Puans were described in a much less flattering manner. In reference to the Puans, Holland wrote that they were the only tribe in Wisconsin that used horses, and they were the fiercest of warriors. They were very untrustworthy, superstitious, and insolent, and not only took the scalps of their enemies, but devoured their bodies at their feasts. The Potawatomi were willing to share the land with the Puans, but the Puans weren't having any of it. They decided instead to kick the peaceful, loving, affable Potawatomi off their land
into the Potawatomi Islands. But they weren't satisfied with that. Instead, they wanted to wipe them out completely. The Potawatomi then decided that they needed to strike first. So they decided to launch a night attack. So they sent out 3 scouts to scout ahead, light a signal fire, and make sure there was a clear landing zone. And then they would bring them in, and hopefully they would catch the Pawans off guard. However, the scouts were captured beforehand, and they were tortured. So 2 of them died, and the last one gave up what the plan was. The Pawans, knowing this, in their devious nature, of course, according to Holland, decided that they would light fires in the wrong location. And so that when the Potawatomis came ashore, they wrecked ashore on the stony limestone of Door County. A few of them survived, though, and the Pawans were waiting. The Potawatomi challenged them, and many Pawans jumped down to fight them. Then a giant wave came in and wiped them all off. The Pawans now realized that the Potawatomi sent their only force against them and now were wide open for attack. So they decided that they would launch a counterattack onto Washington Island. Then suddenly a huge storm picked up and killed out the entire Pawan force. The Pawan villagers waited eagerly for the return of their victorious warriors, but as the canoes started to wash ashore, they realized what happened. The Pawans from then onward decided never to cross it again, naming the passage the Door of Death. So, some problems here. All these narratives presented by these historians have a few similarities, especially those presented by Martin and Fox. All 3 of these accounts attribute Death's Door name to a climatic battle between 2 homogeneous native forces. Though the battle is never given a specific year, it is implied to be before white settlement in Wisconsin, and most likely somewhere between the mid-17th to the early 18th century. Despite sharing some similarities, all 3 of these accounts are problematic when dealing with historical accuracy. The accounts of Martin and Fox are not just similar, they seem like they copy and paste each other and merely replace who was involved. Both accounts talk about 2 distinct tribes who are indigenous to the Potawatomi Islands, suddenly abandoning the island for the mainland, only for a different tribe to swoop in and take it over. The original tribe then decides to counterattack with all their forces and are wiped out in a large storm while trying to reach Washington Island. The only notable difference between Fox and Martin is that Martin claims that the fight is between the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi, and Fox claims the fight is between the Potawatomi and the Nokets. Sorry. Of these 2 scenarios, Fox's account is more accurate than Martin's. The Potawatomi are actually indigenous to Western Michigan and did not arrive in Door County until the local Pawans were nearly annihilated. So a local Potawatomi village being under attack from an invading Ojibwe force, a tribe that came right around the same time to reach Wisconsin, did not make sense chronologically. More important to that is the Council of the 3 Fires. This was a federation of 3 tribes that had been in permanent alliance dating back to the 8th or 9th century, and was made up of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa. So having a fight between the Potawatomi and the Ojibwe makes even less sense, knowing that these 2 nations had been allies for centuries by this point. Fox's account mentions the Nokets, who are a close relative of the Menominee, as the original inhabitants of the island. This makes more sense geographically and historically. Adding on that, the Potawatomi being the invaders makes even more sense as they were chased out of Michigan, thus fleeing to the Potawatomi Islands. One major problem with this, though, neither Martin nor Fox provide any sources for their accounts. They just kind of said it happened. Martin states that the story is a local legend that is probably based in fact. It is unknown where Martin got the story from, but since his book deals with Door County as a whole and not Death's Door specifically, it's possible he did not put a lot of time into the research of this piece. His statement that it is a legend that is probably based in fact shows that he is trying to not tell an exact history, but more of a possible background to explain his book. Fox's only explanation is, so the story goes. Since Fox published his article over 30 years after Martin published his book on Door County, it is possible that Fox took Martin's narrative as a base and switched around the participants. Similar to Martin, Fox's work is not actually about death's door, and instead is used to provide context for the main topic of his paper. Sorry. The fact that he concludes the narrative with "so the story goes" shows how little effort was put into his explanation of the death's door narrative. Due to a complete lack of sources, credible or otherwise, I can say it's safe to say to disregard Martin and Fox's account. Now that the two shorter accounts have been explained, let's move on to the longer and much more widely known account of Hjalmar Holland. To start off, Holland does actually cite sources. Holland's sources include Jonathan Carver's travel through the Indian parts of North America, 1766 to 1768. He mentions Samuel Storo and Stambaugh, the primary sources we talked about. And he talks about one Captain John Brink, who was an engineer who surveyed parts of Door County in 1834. Carver's account is where he gets the idea the Puans were from Mexico and invaded the Door Peninsula. This can be disregarded since we know the Puans were native to northeast Wisconsin and that the Potawatomi didn't even arrive until the mid-17th century. As for Storo and Stambaugh, Storo mentions the name Death's Door came from a death of a number of Potawatomis, but doesn't mention why they're going through the area or the involvement of a second tribe. Stambaugh, on the other hand, talks about a large number of natives dying in a storm, but states that they were part of a trade fleet, not a military expedition. So it's kind of easy to see if you kind of take these two, split them in half, take out some more relevant details, and mix them together. You can kind of come up with this idea about a narrative how a number of Potawatomis were killed in a storm while crossing Death's Door. So what about Captain John Brink? In Holland's footnotes, he mentions that Brink wrote an account about a surprise attack of 300 natives passing through Death's Door. There was a signal fire that was supposed to be lit, but one of the scouts betrayed their plan to the enemy, and the signal fire was lit in the wrong place, and the incoming native army was destroyed. This account is similar to Holland's version. However, Brink does not mention which tribe was involved, so he doesn't have that larger context about the Puans and the Potawatomi. Brink, though, is also questionable in his credibility. See, he lived for quite a while after he wrote his account, and he would even publish things for the Milwaukee Sentinel in 1899. In it, he mentions of another account that he had, the only time he ran into natives while he was in Wisconsin. He said he was invited to a wedding and he had a friend who could speak their language. When he was there, he openly admitted he didn't speak any of their languages. He had no idea what they were doing. And he was scared for his safety. So him and his friend just kind of picked up, left, and never went back. And so we're supposed to accept that this person who doesn't understand native languages or customs or even is comfortable around natives somehow knows this really in-depth native legend about Death's Door. So I find it's kind of hard to imagine that his sources are extremely credible. Holland also may have got his information from other sources he didn't mention. One notable source would be Nicolas Perrault. Perrault was a Frenchman from the 17th century who wrote about Wisconsin during his time period. It is due to his accounts we know about the Puans' significant decline in population between the 1630s and the 1650s. He writes an account about the Puans in which a large fleet of 500 men was meant to attack the Meskwaki, or as many people call them today, the Fox. However, the Puans got caught in a large storm en route and they were all wiped out. Though it is against the wrong tribe, this would match up with the idea of a large Puan force being lost in a storm. Holland may have also used the accounts of Martin and Fox, as he mentions a counterattack led to the destruction of a war party. So if we took all the sources provided, we can start to piece together where Holland got his narrative from. The invading Puans came from Carver. The loss of a Puan war party in a large storm comes from Perrault. The loss of a large number of Potawatomi in a large storm comes from a combination of Storo and Stambaugh. The loss of a war party and a counterattack came from Martin and Fox, and the surprise attack and signal fires came from Captain Brink. Martin, Fox, and Holland may have been incorrect in their own way, but all of them have simplified the context of the time period. All three historians are talking about a singular event between homogeneous nations, rather than the complexity that was the village-style governments of 17th century Wisconsin. Instead of a homogeneous Potawatomi versus Puans, Nokets, or Ojibwe, there would have been alliances of interconnected villages and a conflict that is to say, if it was militaristic in nature at all. I don't mean to say that all that Martin, Fox, and Holland are specifically bad at being historians, rather that many historians around this time period had a similar way of thinking. These historians did not exist inside of a bubble, free from the prejudices, morals, and thought processes of their contemporaries. Rather, these men were a symptom of a time period which would explain their assumption of military conflicts between homogenous tribes, their lack of understanding concerning tribal practices, and their trust of minor accounts about death's door by non-experts. There we go. What actually happened? We came to the presentation with the understanding that I would have some definitive answer where the name Death's Door came from. I'm sorry to disappoint. I do, however, have a few ideas I believe are credible in the naming of Death's Door. The first scenario I propose is that the events the name came from took place prior to European contact. This would be the greatest amount of time for the name to spread, and there would be no written sources to confirm this. Oral histories dating to prior to the 1630s by the Ho-Chunk, who are the descendants of the Puans, or the Menominee, would be needed to give validity to this scenario. The second scenario involves the Puans and would take place between the arrival of Jean Nicolet and the return of the French in the 1650s. This could explain, at least partially, why the Puans suffered such a decline in population in only 20 years. Though Perrault's account of 500 Puans being lost in a storm is not stated to be lost at Death's Door, the possibility could line up with the sharp decline in population that they suffered. Though this would not be the sole reason for the decline, it could be part of the reason. The last scenario, and what I believe to be the most likely, involves majority Potawatomi villages between the 1650s and the 1720s. As mentioned earlier, Potawatomi-dominated villages would form large trade fleets filled with hundreds of pounds of fur and would travel to French trade posts to sell their furs in exchange for firearms. Mostly this was done during times of peace when the travel was easy to accomplish and not be attacked by Iroquois warriors. The main stretches, as I mentioned earlier, would be between 1660 and the 1670s and after the wars completed in 1701. This scenario would involve one of these trade fleets leaving or returning from a trade mission, would be caught in a storm, and it would kill the trade party. This would have been a notable loss of life due to a lack of numbers due to the previous war that was going on, as well as the value of the goods lost as well. If this event leading to the name of Death's Door happened during the first stretch of time, and as this here shows the idea of the trade routes, Montreal being beyond that last red star, if it was during the first one, it would be heading towards Montreal. They would have needed to leave from the Door Peninsula over the top of Michigan, down into Lake Erie, through Lake Ontario, and up through Montreal, and then a return trip. If it's event leading to Death's Door happened after 1701, there could have been two possible destinations. The first would have been to Detroit, which was the main trade hub of the French between 1701 and 1711. I've noted Detroit down there with the second red star in the middle of the map. And the second one would be Michilimackinac, or as many people know it today, Mackinac Island, which I've noted here as the first red star between the UP and the mainland. As Michilimackinac was the main trade hub from the French from 1712 onward. Since Father Crespo's account comes from 1728, the event would have taken place prior to 1728 at the latest. This would place the Potawatomi around Death's Door, around the correct time period, and would give them believable motivations to cross the passage. For what it's worth, most primary sources that mention the tribe include the Potawatomi, and the secondary sources, despite having their own problems, all include the Potawatomi as well. These accounts are just a few scenarios I believe could explain the naming of Death's Door, but they are far from certainties. We may never know what truly happened for people to call the passage of water above the Door Peninsula Death's Door, and that's okay. We as historians, museologists, and the general public should come to terms with the concept that there are some things we will never know, historically at least. Some history can be lost to time, yet we can disprove incorrect interpretations and come to a more relative area of the truth, and that is sometimes the best we can hope for. So what to take away? So there are a few key points to take away from this presentation. First is that the name Death's Door is a historically accurate name that refers to a passage of water that connects Green Bay to Lake Michigan. Second is that the time period the naming may have come from is complex, messy, and has few written sources to back it up. Third is the naming has several possibilities, but most likely has something to do with the Potawatomi or the Quans. Lastly is that we may never know where the name comes from, and that's fine. Sometimes dispelling incorrect answers is just as useful as finding correct ones. Here's some more information that I found useful. If you're interested, The Middle Ground by Richard White and The Misunderstood Mission of Jean Nicolet by Patrick Young are rather useful, especially for understanding the time period in which this legend may have came from. Death's Door in Pursuit of a Legend by Conan Bryant Eden is very well researched and has, I believe, 4 different editions. However, despite so many editions, it's very difficult to get a physical copy. I've tried twice to get a copy of it, and both times I've gotten refunds and an automatic email saying they didn't have it. However, there are online scans of, I believe, the first edition you can find. I also have it on good authority that you can find it at the Eastern Historical Foundation, so you can bother them for their copy as well. And finally, Door County, Wisconsin, the County Beautiful by Helmer Holland. I know I just described why I believe that their version is wrong, but it's important to go back to the source to look at other legends they have and see other types of stories that we believe about Door County due to books like these. It's and also, you know, it can be a good read. So, thank you. So, happy to take questions at this time. Thank you. Why do I have to change my screen? Oh, sorry. I am just stop share. Okay. Okay. And yep. Okay. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
It would be very interesting to just chronicle or just list all the stories that you hear,
Yeah.
whether they're true or not. I was born and raised in Fishcraft, you know, and there's all kinds of stories about Death's Door that are, and also a harbor that was an egg white and those kinds of things. It'd be interesting just to come up with a fictitious a story of what do they call them? You know, fables or something like that. Death's Door, Egg Harbor, you know, a lot of them like Bailey's Harbor, the family, and whatever. But thanks for doing that.
Yeah, of course. No, and that's a very interesting idea. Yeah.
They asked the other thing that I made the light bulb, but she never got discouraged. She said, I never did it. Every day I found something that wouldn't work.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll have to repeat questions as they come up. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Have they ever gone, we're talking about people going and trading furs for guns.
Right.
And this is a return party that might have been loaded with guns. Has anybody gone down looking for any of that?
Okay. So for those online, the question was, have anyone gone down to look for the guns that could have been lost? The answer I can give shortly is I don't know, but people have been looking around the sunken wrecks around Door County for quite some time. We have hundreds of notable wrecks all around the area. And so people have been looking for a lot of very interesting things over the years as they've gone by, notably Le Griffin, this huge ship that just disappeared and no one knew what happened to it. And everyone claims to find it every 10 minutes. So as people, something like that, the problem is that we have surviving shipwrecks. It's good because ships are kept at deep fathoms in the water. They are kept in a very cold environment. It preserves them and everything that's on board. And that is something that it's really unique to see. The thing is that these would have been canoes with birch bark, and those probably would have been ripped to pieces, and then everything inside them would be scattered and spread around over something like 3 to 4 centuries. So trying to find a specific site, and that's even to say if my scenario is completely true. I wouldn't put it past someone to try to look for it. People have been trying to find all sorts of stuff, from Le Griffin to Confederate gold off Poverty Island. So the answer is I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past someone to try.
That's only 200 or 300 years, so I think we should all start our own and make it a combination of, the Bermuda Triangle, the Mariana Trench, and then what, 300 years from now, there will be people sitting in this thing probably trying to figure out how Zoom works.
Yeah. Time melding.
Yeah.
We've got a couple online questions.
Sure, sure.
Why does it seem that the oral history of Death's Door Native Americans is discounted and written narratives are preferred? I was under the impression cultural oral history can be quite accurate and confirmed.
It can be, but as we see that a lot of the museums and tourist destinations and local tour guides, a lot of them will pick up on Holland or Martin or Fox, and they'll just keep repeating those. And those historians generally didn't take oral histories very seriously unless it suited them specifically. Some of them mentioned something like this was a local fishing village that they heard from some natives, but didn't talk about where they heard it from, which fishermen and what area of Washington Island and which natives from that. I believe modern Native oral history should be taken extremely seriously on this. But as the public is more concerned with a lot more of the flashy things, like the tale from Holland, those are the ones that are taken a lot more seriously, unfortunately. I would like to see if there are more Native oral histories about this. I just need to figure out where I need to start looking.
Could you speak to some of the dangerous conditions in the Death's Door passage and how mariners have helped encourage the popularized naming due to local conditions?
Okay, I do know that the passage Death's Door is dangerous at times. It can get really calm and then really violent really quickly. There are also a lot of shoals or a lot of like really shallow water around certain areas that can make that difficult to navigate. And all of Door County, which is part of the Niagara Escarpment, is made out of limestone and not a lot of sandy beaches. So if you're going to crash, you're not going to hit something soft. You're going to hit something extremely hard. So that's part of it. Also, Death's Door, as I mentioned, was the most traveled trade route in Wisconsin until the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal was built in the late 19th century. So if you wanted to get from Green Bay to Milwaukee or Chicago or vice versa, you went through Death's Door. So I think a lot of the shipwrecks there are explained kind of like, are you going to find more car crashes on a back road or on a highway? You're just going to find a lot more ships in the area. So I think that might build up part of it. As for the dangerous conditions, we would need some kind of oral history or written account that would state that the dangerous conditions is why we call it Death's Door. And some people have claimed that from like the 1850s. But since the earliest account we have is Crespel, and no one in Crespel's entourage died during this problem, I doubt he would have named it Death's Door because a few canoes broke and they had to now kind of carpool. So, I'm not against the idea that it is due to dangerous conditions, but I haven't really found any sources outside of similar to the primary resources saying that it's dangerous and there's bad winds and there's rough water and there are some rocks. Because there's also passages in Detroit Island, which is just between Detroit Island and Plum Island. There is the Rock Island Passage. There are passages all along those individual islands leading up the Niagara Escarpment into the UP. So I don't know why Death's Door would be specifically dangerous, except for all the people using it all the time. So. Okay, anyone else?
see everybody February 3rd. Same time, same place. Death door paintings, finding the cave paintings.
Oh, I know what he's talking about. Those are the pictographs. There was one author, we have his book in our archives, and I have one at home actually. I think it was like a self-published book or done through one of the very local presses that talked about death's door relation to pictographs. There are these large paintings on the cliffside around death's door in northern Door County. And the book claims that these pictographs tell a story relating to death's door. I've seen a lot of his sources, and they helped me find some primary sources for my research. But I don't think they're never mentioned at all about the pictographs. Except I think maybe one time. So I'm not sure if there's exactly a great association between the legend and the pictographs themselves. But I'm not a huge expert actually on the pictographs specifically. So I don't know really where they came from or why they were there. So it looks like the book was also trying to use it as a means to get people to take interest and try to restore the pictographs before they're like wiped out. So another matter.
Somebody's asking if there's everybody professional archaeological digs in that area. There was a dig up on.
There are underwater archaeologists who will do stuff around Death's Door and around the whole area. The Wisconsin Underwater Archaeological Association will do occasional studies of some of the sunken ships and areas around there, or they'll find fishing nets or gill net stakes. I haven't seen anything that really connects to Death's Door specifically. So. I don't know that around Death's Door. I think they died down as the 20th century started coming in. Modern technology, along with life-saving stations, the ship canal made it not as necessary to go over that anymore. But it's not like as soon as the canal was built, shipwrecks just stopped suddenly. It's just they became less common. So, yeah. Are they talking about Death's Door specifically? Because if we're talking Door County, there was a few in Sturgeon Bay, but those were purposely lit on fire and scuttled. So there's like 3 of them that are just down that way, like a mile.
There's no specific.
Okay. Well, yeah. Oh, most definitely. All the time. Yeah. No. People. We when we talk about the number of shipwrecks, Wisconsin says like 700 out of like the 10,000 in all the Great Lakes. Problem is that these are ones where like we found something, and a lot of times if you go back and look at old newspapers, they'll say like this ship lost, and then you can't find it on a modern map. A lot of times things were just lost and torn extremely off course or way off from the coastline. So there's probably a lot more missing there. And in fact, when they made the new marine sanctuary along the eastern coast of Wisconsin, which is meant to preserve a lot of the shipwrecks, they're suspecting they're going to find a lot more because now they're actually looking at them and they're sending drones in to scan the water and try to look for it. So I imagine we're going to find a lot more shipwrecks coming around. So, oh yeah, most definitely.
Where's the best place to find very old maps of the Death's Door area?
I've tried looking for maps. If you look at the book I mentioned by Patrick Young, The Misunderstood Mission of Jean Nicolet, there are maps in his book from that area. I couldn't really find some really old 17th century map that says Port Timor, Skull and Crossbones, this is where everyone dies. A lot of times it's like a very strange drawing as they were trying to understand what Wisconsin really looked like. Death's Door, as far as I can see, didn't really start becoming popular on maps, at least from my own research, until like the 19th century. So around 100, 150 years ago. So I'm not sure we're going to find a bunch of sudden, unless we're really lucky, find a bunch of royal maps, just say Destor, like, yeah, this is the first time right here, Destor in the passage. This is where it all came from, guys. Pack it up, go home. It's done. It's like I'd love to find that, but it's probably that people knew about it locally and then it didn't start being put on maps until like the 1860s or 70s. So. Okay. Right,